Okay, so first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizers and the panel. I'm speaking today about complicity. Complicity has been one of the most frequently used, but I think little understood political concepts of the last decade in the US and the UK. And in this talk, I want to discuss some of the ways it's been used in recent times, before offering a longer view of its place in intellectual history since World War II and its aftermath, when its modern usage was first popularized. I want to do this because complicity has a definite history, which we can learn from, but which I think we're in danger of forgetting. And that history, I want to suggest, is the history of post-war liberalism and its slow death, and perhaps now accelerating death. So definitional questions first. Complicity derives from the Latin complicare, which means to fold. We are complicit when we are folded into a structure, usually one the speaker or writer recognizes as harmful, over which we have little or no direct control. Complicity is a spatial figure then, which connotes ideas of claustrophobia and confinement. We are trapped, we are entangled in something, like a fish in a net, and are consequently confined or restricted in some way which compromises our freedom. Note, it is the complicit subject's freedom which is at stake here, not that of the persons being harmed by the structure. To remove oneself from complicity is not to dismantle the structure, it is to unfold oneself and therefore to restore its freedom. Situations of complicity tend to be temporalized in distinctive ways too. There is a drama of recognition. Recognition of one's own complicity tends to come retrospectively when some new vantage is reached from which to look back. This temporality of complicity can be usefully compared to that of the old Freudian idea of Nachträglichkeit, sometimes translated as deferred action or afterwardsness, by which a past experience is activated for memory in the light of some trigger in the present and re-narrativized. Once we realize we are complicit, we might be compelled to incorporate ourselves into a story we previously believed we played no part in. Complicity has been an essentially liberal structure of feeling. I use that term precisely in Raymond Williams's sense to describe a system of ideas which are experienced as felt and thought. According to Williams, structures of feeling, are social experiences in solution, captured in the moment before they are formalized and reified. They are provisional, fluid, and made partially legible by their expression across a range of media and forms in a particular historical moment. The reason complicity has been a liberal structure of feeling is that the discourse surrounding it, from confessions of one's own complicity to accusations that others have become complicit, turns ultimately on those dramas of the individual conscience, its autonomy under threat, its freedom at risk. The capacity of the individual subject to determine their own ends and pursue their own self-flourishing are found in contradiction with the rights of others to do the same. So let's begin in the last decade then, for we're living in a moment when the term complicity is evoked frequently, sometimes bewilderingly frequently, and in many contexts. In 2017, dictionary.com chose complicity as its word of the year. I'm still trying to work out what that really means, but it's a fact. We might speculate on the confluence of this moment with the arrival of the first Trump presidency and widespread public discussion among American liberals over the question of how far responsibility for the subsequent shifts in policy might reach. One such was Erica Newland, a lawyer who served in the Justice Department from 2016 to 2018. She wrote a confessional article in the New York Times attesting to her complicity in what she saw as, quote, an assault on our democracy. Newland had worked on the so-called Muslim ban, which had prevented citizens of predominantly Muslim countries from entering the United States. Her job had involved tailoring executive orders to make them more palatable to the courts. and this is what she confessed. No matter our intentions, we were complicit. We collectively perpetuated an anti-democratic leader by conforming to his assault on reality. We may have been victims of the system, but we were also its instruments. No matter how much any one of us pushed back from within, we did so as members of a professional class of government lawyers who enabled an assault on our democracy, an assault that nearly ended it. Now, this hesitation between victim and instrument is very common in complicit confessions, oscillating between a conviction that one has been played and a realization that one was in fact a player all along. Another common factor is the retrospective orientation. That realization of complicity in the present prompts a reevaluation of one's own past in a new light. What looked like bureaucratic objectivity and professional disinterestedness now appears anti-democratic and racist. Also in 2020, following the 6th of January attack on the Capitol, Anne Applebaum's article for The Atlantic, "History Will Judge the Complicit," belonged to an adjacent genre in the writing of complicity. Rather than confession, this was accusatory. Applebaum argued that high-ranking members of the Republican Party should be compared to those who confronted the Nazis in France in 1940 or the Soviets in East Germany in 1945. Such individuals were, she said, forced to accept an alien ideology or a set of values that are in sharp conflict with their own. The dilemma is whether to preserve one's own privileges and collaborate or risk losing them through flight and withdrawal. Applebaum's article in its comparisons between the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party and mid-century totalitarian regimes asked what good liberals should do when faced with nakedly anti-democratic politics. And she positioned Mitt Romney as the hero of the story for his non-collaboration with the new regime. This is true, you can go and check. Though these two examples of complicit discourse are very different insofar as one is an accusation, the other a confession, my purpose in invoking them together is to draw attention to two factors they have in common. One is the way 21st century complicity discourse tends to draw on the international crises of the mid-20th century as its key reference point, rehearsing the patterns of older reckonings with complicity which arose from the Holocaust and debates about totalitarianism in the 40s and 50s. Applebaum is explicit about this orientation in her comparison between Trumpism, Stalinism, and National Socialism, but Newland's essay, The Confessions of a State Bureaucrat, reflecting on her role in enabling a racist state apparatus, seems to unconsciously rehearse the defenses of German bureaucrats during the denazification process orchestrated by occupying US forces after World War II, and in various trials and tribunals that took place afterwards. That self-identification as both victim and instrument of the regime belongs to this history, and we will return to it. The second factor these two articles have in common is the way they frame state-level anti-democratic policies as problems to be construed at the level of the individual conscience, aberrations from a given moral norm. They use juridical and legal language, but the force of their arguments is directed not towards the courts, but towards individual crises of conscience, failures of moral judgment. Now, my third example is a more recent one. In July 2024, a group of US government officials from across the military, State Department, and elsewhere issued a statement saying that they had resigned when faced with what they called undeniable complicity in the killings and forced starvation of a besieged Palestinian population in Gaza. US foreign policy, they claimed, had failed on 3 counts: being morally reprehensible, in violation of domestic and international humanitarian law, and endangering national security. Here too, then, we find the distinction raised between complicity as a legal problem and as a form of moral injury. The signatories were right to be concerned at the legal liability that accompanies situations of complicity under international law, given the ICJ's determination in the preceding months that Palestine had plausible rights to protection from genocide, which were at risk. The 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, to which both Israel and the US are signatories, explicitly names complicity in genocide as a punishable offense. As the ICJ had explained with reference to its previous rulings on genocide in the former Yugoslavia, complicity, quote, includes the provision of means to enable or facilitate the commission of a crime, unquote. Given the US's consistent provision of arms to Israel during the war, the signatories of the statement had a clear motivation to avoid liability in any future international legal proceedings. This concern, like those of Newland and Applebaum, finds its crucial reference point in the mid-20th century response to totalitarianism and World War II in the form of the 48 Convention, itself one of the crucial historical documents for the emergence of complicity as a key concept for the post-war liberal order. The signatories of the statement separate out the moral issue from the legal one, and indeed complicity does function differently in the two contexts. For cases of genocide under international law, a complicit state must take some demonstrable action in support of the perpetrator. In the more nebulous moral context, the one which keeps people awake at night, complicity is consequent more often on inaction, what one fails to do, what one fails to say. The phrase silence is complicity is now ubiquitous. Biden proclaimed it on Twitter shortly after the 7th of October in condemning Hamas's atrocities against Israelis. But it has also been used many times as a rallying cry by protesters calling on Israel to stop its assault on Gaza. And in this sense, silence is complicity risks becoming an empty mantra. It rests on the assumption that one can disentangle oneself from the folds of complicity simply by speaking, and also that withdrawal from a complicit situation is itself a form of collective political action. Both are questionable. Those who wrote the Service in Dissent joint statement closed by emphasizing that, quote, your voice matters. Speaking up has a snowball effect, inspiring others to use their voice. There is strength in numbers, and we urge you not to be complicit, unquote. The coupling of collective political power and the disavowal of moral complicity is hard to find borne out by the historical record, but it is part of an influential rhetorical tradition in the US. Here we can go back past the mid-20th century, at which our modern concept of complicity crystallized, all the way back to 19th century abolitionism, and in particular the work of Henry David Thoreau. Though he tended not to use the term, many of the ideas and arguments mobilized by Thoreau in his political essays bear close relation to what we now call complicity. Written in the years of tension leading up to the American Civil War, essays like Resistance to Civil Government, which I'm sure many of you have read, and Slavery in Massachusetts, advocate for radical non-complicity, that is, a withdrawal of the self from entanglement with US colonial violence in the Mexican War, the theft of native lands, and with the cruelties and injustices of chattel slavery. It involved a form of disaffiliation from the apparatus of the state itself. Quote, I cannot for a moment recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also, unquote. Though resistance to civil government was occasioned by Thoreau's temporary refusal to pay his taxes and therefore to fund war and slavery, it is rather his public, eloquent articulation of disaffiliation and withdrawal from the polis that have earned the essay its place in the canon. The ideology of withdrawal was one he revised in following years. That's evident in the sympathetic account he offered in the 1850s of violent rebellion in his essays on the anti-slavery radical John Brown. Not that John Brown, another John Brown. It was resistance to civil government, however, that found a privileged place in the US literary tradition during the 20th century, and especially during the post-45 era, when its exhortations for radical non-complicity through negation, disavowal, disaffiliation, refusal, withdrawal, found a sympathetic readership in the New Left, the anti-war counterculture, and civil rights movements. One of his most prominent readers was Martin Luther King, who wrote in 1962 that the essay had helped to convince him that, quote, non-cooperation with evil is just as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good, unquote. We can see then that the liberal discourse of complicity, with its emphasis on moral obligation, crises of conscience, and the ethos of non-cooperation, has a long history in the US. Those moments when the discourse of complicity rises to the surface of public attention tend to correspond to periodic crises in American liberalism, when the contradictions between its professed commitments to individual rights and liberties come up hard against the reality of empire and racial domination, and erupt into plain sight even for those who did their best to preserve their innocence. If Thoreau's essay exemplifies the first such crisis in the 1840s and 50s, then the anti-racist, anti-war, and anti-colonial struggles of the long 60s inaugurated a second. And in the last decade or so, we can observe a third. But the nature of complicity discourse is such that it's difficult to grasp from the inside, as it were, when one is already entangled in its folds. And it's for this reason that we should turn to those mid-century transatlantic thinkers such as Hannah Arendt and Jean-Paul Sartre, who made strenuous efforts in the years after World War II to formulate theories of complicity from a position outside the orbit of the American liberal tradition, but able nevertheless to speak to it. Arendt and Sartre, for all their many divergences, held in common a skepticism about the political use of complicity as a concept, which we may do well to consider today. And the best place to begin is Arendt's own criticism of Thoreau's resistance to civil government. In her 1969 book, Crises of the Republic, Arendt took up a renewed interest in Thoreau by the New Left and counterculture movements and criticized them for what she saw as their fundamental misunderstanding of his work. If one could wipe one's hands clean through acts of disaffiliation and disavowal, as Thoreau had exhorted his audiences to in the Concord Lyceum in 1840s, what need of organized mass politics? It was a mistake, she argued, to consider Thoreau a political writer at all. Quoting the passage in which Thoreau writes of the duty of people to wash their hands of wrong, and when he says, if he gives it no longer thought, not to give it practically his support. Arendt claimed that Thoreau wrote not as a citizen at all, but as an individual conscience interested only in moral obligation. Consequently, she said, quote, here as elsewhere, conscience is unpolitical. It is not primarily interested in the world where the wrong is committed, or in the consequences that the wrong will have for the future course of the world, unquote. Thoreau's conscience, she went on, trembles for the individual self and its integrity, while his readers in the counterculture and civil rights movement had mistaken self-interest for political action. The identification of the moral self as the focus of such a discourse does not have to be understood as derogatory. It may be necessary to proclaim such a disaffiliation in order, quite simply, to go on living with oneself. But for Arendt, that should not be confused with actions taken in order to improve the shared social world. Her touchstone for these judgments reached back to her experience of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. There she had observed ordinary Germans withdrawing from participation in public life as National Socialism began to take hold. And in that context, active resistance carried the risk of persecution and ultimately death. Faced with a choice between a collusion that violated the conscience, high-risk resistance, or retreat, many, for perfectly understandable reasons, chose the latter. Arendt was one of the first intellectuals to observe, name, and theorize complicity as a collective social phenomenon. And she did that in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which received renewed attention during Trump's first administration in 2016 to 20, as liberals sought to make sense of the US's seeming descent into authoritarianism. An important aspect of Arendt's landmark book that gets persistently overlooked is her argument that the Nazis systematically and deliberately implicated the whole of German society in their criminality, causing them to experience guilt feelings about crimes for which they were not, in any conventional sense, responsible. The terror was conducted in the open, so to speak, as was the persecution of Jews, communists, and other minority groups. Criminality was the order of the day, and high-ranking Nazis bragged about their crimes. Everybody knew. They were left to deal with that knowledge in their own private ways, through denial, turmoil, and internal conflicts of conscience. This was what Arendt sometimes called organized guilt, and sometimes simply called complicity. She described it as an atmosphere that came to pervade and choke German life, eventually leading to the complete collapse of moral standards. Complicity was the complement of violent repressive force, working in tandem with it in order to secure control. It was, in her account, a successful tactic, which led to widespread compliance among liberal-minded Germans who felt they had little choice but to throw in their lot with the party. Arendt's skepticism about the social and political functions of complicity and her conviction that the feelings associated with it could allow gullible liberals to be exploited by anti-democratic regimes stayed with her throughout her career. In the 60s, as the Black freedom struggle gained prominence in public discourse, she left her readers in no doubt. Quote, "There is no such thing as being or feeling guilty for things that happened without one actively participating in them. This is an important point," she said, "worth making loudly and clearly at a moment when so many good white liberals confess to guilt feelings." By the 60s, expressions of white liberal guilt and the fraught debate surrounding them had become ubiquitous to the point of cliché. Arendt tried to cut through them, but with little effect. The discourse of complicity had become embedded in American liberal life just as it is today. But Arendt's politics had a number of blind spots too, not least of which was the US's own empire. In Origins, Arendt had identified European colonialism in Africa and the horrific racial violence that accompanied it as one of the historical events that had created the conditions in which totalitarian regimes could later thrive. There was no place for the US in her analysis, however, and in her later work, virtually no room for discussion of the US's own tradition of white supremacy and racial domination. Arendt's insights into the problem of complicity were not given opportunity to be tested or modified in such contexts, and this limits the capacity of her work to guide us in the present moment. For an account of complicity that does attend to post-war colonialism and racial domination, we can turn to another European intellectual whose ideas were shaped by their experience of Nazism and World War II, that is Jean-Paul Sartre. For 15 or so years after World War II, a large number of Americans would have considered him the most prominent philosopher in the world. The philosophical ideas he generated under the banner of existentialism during the war, and then presented to a receptive new public in the US immediately afterwards, were easily assimilated into a nascent Cold War liberalism. The individual subject was alone in a godless world and had to confront their radical personal responsibility for both their freedom and that of others. Existentialism was in vogue among the highbrows and the mass culture. But during the course of the 50s and 60s, Sartre's unrepentant Marxism, his support for violent resistance to colonialism in Cuba, Algeria, and elsewhere, and his conviction that the American war in Vietnam was genocidal, eventually made him a persona non grata for mainstream intellectual life in the US. His reputation today has hardly recovered. However, his writing on complicity and colonialism speak to our present moment. It was Algeria that galvanized his thinking on complicity. He wrote from his perspective in Paris, looking out upon a colonized people intent on winning their freedom. In 1956, as the Algerian War began, he wrote his essay, Colonialism is a System, a resolutely material analysis of French rule that insisted, above all, on purging anti-colonial thought of its preoccupations with moral complexity. This he called neo-colonialist mystification. It was a mistake, he claimed, to imagine that there are some good colonists and some very wicked ones, and that it's the fault of the latter that the situation in the colonies has deteriorated. For Sartre, there was no right way to do empire. There are colonists, and that's it. Colonialism, he reminded his readers in France, was neither a chance occurrence nor the result of 1,000 individual choices. Rather, it was a system with its own implacable capitalist logic, which began in the 19th century and was now running out of steam. Instead of ethics, the War of Independence should be conceived of in terms of politics, a struggle for independence being undertaken by dominated people fighting for their own interests. There was no question of ameliorating colonialism. And of course, Sartre was heavily influenced by the Martinican thinker Frantz Fanon, particularly in the way that he saw violence as integral to the functioning of the colonial system. The only solution was to shatter it. Sartre's essay attempted to persuade metropolitan France to turn its energies to achieve that goal. The next year, he wrote another essay which is far less known, called You Are Wonderful. And it goes much further in addressing the problem of distant complicity with colonial violence. Here he returns to the matters of conscience that he dismissed in colonialism as a system. But he does so only in order to jolt his readers out of their habits of self-examination and into political action. By this point in the war, news of French atrocities against Algerian civilians, including widespread use of torture, were filtering through to the French public, though they were not acknowledged by the government. Sartre's essay addresses the ways that French citizens preserved a state of denial about the nature and extent of the atrocities. Its distinctive power is in the way Sartre evokes the curious state of what he calls guilty innocence, by which people manage to continue their lives as if they didn't know what they clearly did know, that France was perpetrating war crimes and crimes against humanity in its colony. According to this paradox of guilty innocence, one simultaneously knows and doesn't know what is being done in one's name. Sartre describes how the French desperately tried to avoid discovering details of the torture, how they tried to avoid discussing it with their neighbors. The result, however, is a kind of nightmare atmosphere descending on French society, leading everyone to exist in their own private shame. For Sartre, the paralyzing sense of guilty innocence distributed amongst the people of a colonial power is precisely what the leaders of the country want. And here he comes close to Arendt's concept of complicity as organized guilt. He says, "We are not naive. We are not naive, we are dirty. Our consciences have not been disturbed, and yet they are not clear. Our leaders know this full well. This is how they like us. What they want to achieve by their attentive care and their well-publicized consideration is, under the pretense of fake ignorance, our complicity." So complicity becomes a tool for maintaining the status quo. At the root of Sartre's thinking here is his signature concept of bad faith, the state in which we exist for most of the time for him. It describes the ways that we run away from or deny our own capacity as actors in the world with responsibility for its injustices. In states of bad faith, we imagine ourselves to be things acted upon rather than selves capable of changing the world. We kid ourselves that we are not free to choose our actions, our commitments, our politics. This is the logic behind the description of the massacres in Gaza as a humanitarian catastrophe to be addressed by sending aid, as if it were a natural disaster that had done the killing. Complicity in colonial violence for Sartre is a form of collective bad faith in which we accept limited guilt in return for being freed from responsibility, and it suits our ruling class very well. So for both Arendt and Sartre, complicity is produced socially by anti-democratic systems of government. Moreover, such systems do so by design, as a deliberate tactic for confounding the concepts of guilt and responsibility in the interest of reproducing relations of domination. The value of returning to their thought is twofold. On the one hand, it brings to the surface the sense in which debates about complicity in the US and the UK are really debates about liberalism since World War II in its state of denial about the material reality of colonialism and systemic racial domination. Perhaps more urgently, however, they invite us to step outside of the complicity frame, however briefly or provisionally, to see it from the outside, as a structure of feeling with both a distinctive history and an identifiable set of social functions. As such, they remind us of the possibility, even the necessity, that it will one day pass into history. Speaking as a literary scholar, I can say that complicity has been a tremendously productive terrain to inhabit and explore for both writers and critics. This because of the inherent affinity of literary culture since World War II for complexity, ambiguity, and contradiction. It's no coincidence that the emergence of complicity as a fully fledged concept coincided with the professionalization of literary criticism and its institutionalization in the academy. But complicity discourse has not served the democratic ends that this conference appeals to. And until we can recognize and describe its functions confidently, we remain lost in its folds. Thank you.
Thank you.